Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks to everyone for coming today. This is very exciting to bring these brilliant minds all together to do our collective inquiry. And so I'm very excited to introduce you to our next speakers. This is Emilie Keldie, who's the director of the Felix Gonzalez Torres Foundation. I worked with Emilie for months to bring the Felix Gonzalez Torres stack piece, and she was just such a pleasure to work with and so helpful. The foundation was founded in 2002. It focuses its activities on creating resources and supporting projects that preserve openness and demonstrate the potential for change to continually unfold around the work of Gonzalez Torres over time. Keldie holds an MA in Arts Administration from Columbia University. Her studies focused on arts law and the varied roles of private foundations. And okay. I am also delighted to introduce David Sr., who will be interviewing Emilie Keldie. David Sr. is the head of Libraries and Archives at SF MoMA. Formerly, he was a senior bibliographer at the Museum of Modern Art Library in New York. At MoMA, he was responsible for developing the library's collections, especially its artist books collection. He also curated many exhibitions of MoMA library materials, including access to tools, publications from the Whole Earth Catalog, 1968 to 74. For the last 10 years, he has organized a program of events for Printed Matter's New York Art Book Fair, and more recently, at the Los Angeles Art Book Fair. A book documenting his exhibition of artist invitations and show flyers from the MoMA Library called Please Come to the Show was published by Occasional Papers in 2014. He serves on the advisory committees of Printed Matter, the Center for Book Arts, and Art Resources Transfer, and he is on the board of directors of Primary Information and Yale Union. Senior's first job in a special library was as the reference assistant in the History of Cartography collection at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and he subsequently spent a couple of years selling old maps at the Philadelphia print shop. Did you ever buy any, David Rumsey? Okay, so please carry on.
So as Emilie was mentioning, the foundation primarily acts as a resource on the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres, and it was formed in 2002, the artist having died in 1996. And in the broadest strokes, basically the way that the foundation does that is by supporting ongoing exhibitions of the work, providing research support for scholarship at all levels, and maintaining a really dynamic archive of information about ongoing exhibitions of the work. I should probably give you just a general background of Felix's work. He's a conceptual artist. Many of the works in his practice are physically manifest anew at the point of each exhibition. And have the potential to change each time they're shown. And that change can play out physically, it can play out in the new content, kind of in all these different ways around the work itself. So the scope of the Foundation Archives and Records really seek to respond to and record that. And one of the ways that we do that is by creating case studies, which are like anecdotal records around each exhibition of the work. So we have a way of keeping information about decisions as they're made over time. So today I'm going to talk through the body of paper stack works, one of which is shown in the exhibition coordinates. And we're kind of going to go deeply into that body of work, and then David and I will discuss a couple other bodies of work and case studies that we think might be relevant to the panel today. Okay, so I pressed it, but I'm waiting. Okay. I'm going to come over here. So here are several instances of paper stack works as they're installed in Frankfurt in 2011. What you have with these works is a basically set of specific yet open-ended parameters, where you get information or potentially image files, a description, a text that is reproduced or printed on a stack of paper. The paper is then installed in an exhibition space, and each time that they're shown, you have those new materials. Here's a work untitled Ross in LA, 1991. It's shown directly on the floor in the space, and something that Emilie mentioned earlier, an important aspect of the work, is that viewers have the opportunity to choose to take from the work. So what you end up having is that even though there's the opportunity to make decisions as you're exhibiting the work, also over the course of an exhibition of the work, it's constantly in flux. The body of stock works, as far as the content that's actually reproduced on them, varies greatly. Here's untitled NRA, National Rifle Association. What you also see from this are the dimensions of the work, and the height at which they're manifest is also quite variable. And then you've got works like untitled Veterans Day Sale, and here's a detail of that. Where rather than getting any sort of specific image file, you would get a description of exactly what that text is, the spacing in between, the words, the fact that it's, I think it's Calcion, the exact typeface, et cetera, and the relationship of that typeface to the original sheet size. And there's also paper stack works where you have very specific imagery that's reproduced on the stacks. These are clippings, or newspaper clippings that are reproduced on the recto and verso of a work called Untitled Spaghetti, which is very funny. And here is an image of the work installed. So you've also got like quite a difference in scale as far as the body of work. And now that we've looked kind of across that practice, I want to look more specifically at the captions of the work, because there's quite a bit of a type of mapping that happens in the captions themselves. And these are two different paper stack works, each with a representation of a past manifestation of the work. And the first word that I want to call your attention to is this endless supply that's in the caption, which this is funny terminology to find in the caption for an artwork. Usually it is kind of factual, as objective as possible, but the artists actually use the captions as a way of conveying a sort of metadata about the work themselves. And that endless supply speaks to the fact that when the work is installed, it's not as if when you install the work, you are calling upon some set amount of papers that get installed, and once those have been used up, the work is used up as well. Instead, they are reproduced each and every time that they're shown, or there's the potential to do that, and also the potential to reuse sheets if you happen to have them. And that endless supply nods to that. And the next thing I want to look at is the ideal height of each of the works. And ideal in this situation points to a measurement that was true of the first installation of the work, but isn't intended to be an absolute measurement, but instead is something that's negotiated at the point of each exhibition of the work. And not only is it negotiated when the work is installed, but then obviously the height is going to fluctuate depending on how many exhibitors take individual sheets from the stack and how many they take. And then you also have issues of replenishment. David and Emilie may choose to replenish the stack that's downstairs every day, maybe once a week, maybe not at all. All of those options are available to them. And the last thing that I wanted to point out in the captions that I thought might be especially interesting to you all is the systems of measurement that the artist included in each of the captions for the work. So you'll see that Untitled Party Platform was first exhibited in LA in 1991, and the system of measurement is inches. And in Gonzalez Torres' practice in general, he called upon the standard system of measurement in the location where the work was first installed and included that in the caption itself. And as you'll see here, for Untitled's Republican years, first shown in Vienna in 1992, the original paper size is shown in centimeters. And whereas this is kind of information that's easily lost, you'd have to be looking across captions of different artworks to really glean that. What you have is a nod to both the place where the work was first exhibited, but also the processes of choosing these materials. None of these measurements are supposed to be so precious that you're bound by them. And if he was to have chosen a single system of measurement to include in the captions, then the the captions for, or the dimensions rather, for Untitled Republican Years, I think would translate to something like 54.377 inches by, and it would become very difficult for an exhibitor to understand that there is the potential for that sheet size to shift with such an exacting measurement. So now let's look at several past iterations of one paper stack work. This is actually the first in the body of paper stack works, Untitled 1988. It was first shown in the Rostovsky Gallery in New York in 1988, and the original paper size you see here is 8.5 by 11 inches. It's letter size paper. So what you have is a very common paper size, but what's really nice about this work is that the pedestal in and of itself is a really good marker of change in ongoing exhibitions of the work, because even though those dimensions are listed, they end up being quite flexible. This is the full exhibition history of the work, and all that I'm calling out here is that it's been shown in Europe 11 times and it's been shown in the States 4 times. And here's an exhibition that came shortly after, that Rostovsky show, where you see the pedestal is most likely something that they just sourced on site. It happened to be there. That's what was used for the work. And here you have the work shown in Dijon in 2002. Again, the pedestal shifts, and the ideal height of this work is actually only 6.5 inches, which this clearly is quite a bit higher than. And here you have a 2006 showing of the work on the far right, in New York again, where the stack is now quite low. So it's nice to look across these and see the way that the one work can exist in quite a shifting physical capacity in ongoing exhibitions. And another thing that's somewhat difficult to glean from just installation images of the work is that when this work has been shown in Europe, like it is here in Frankfurt in 2011, they don't use 8.5 by 11 size. They use A4 size, which is 8.26 by 11 I can't recall now, but it's slightly different. But there is a very close translation that exists that allows the work to very seamlessly kind of slide between those two exhibition contexts. And this is an example of something that's a very slight change that can play out around the work. But now I want to bring your attention to something more drastic, which is the work that's shown in this exhibition. Untitled 1992-93 is 8 inches at ideal height, and the paper size is 48.25 by 33.25. And as you can see from the people interacting the work, this is a pretty large sheet size. And here's a detail. And here is the work as it's installed right now downstairs. So definitely not at 8 inches. And what you can't necessarily tell from this installation view is that it's only 18 by 24, the sheet size, right? So it's basically half the sheet size it would typically be, which is a pretty drastic interpretation of what is possible in terms of that work. But one of the limiting factors here was that the work was being shown in a library that, from what Emilie tells me, has very conservative rules about where objects can be shown. Many things are considered tripping hazards, so it could not be on the floor. So what they did was brought it on top of a vitrine, because it's part of the nature of the work that it needs to be accessible for viewers to actually be able to choose to take a sheet. And the vitrine ended up determining, in a way, the size of the sheet that they would use. So what happens to these sheets once people take them? this idea of distribution. These works are shown, in multiple locations at once. They've been shown many, many times, and there's no real way of tracking, the distributions of the sheets themselves. But we have just started an archive of Instagram images where people are posting their interactions with Felix Gonzalez Torres's works, like Bird on Wheels here. And there's actually a history of this. This is a 1992 exhibition in Mexico City where school children are taking sheets from a stack called Untitled Aparición. So we do have some of this information in our archives, some of this more historical information in our archives, and we're using that as kind of the rubric to also gather this ongoing archive of the works and other paper stack work Untitled Double Portrait as they're exhibited over time. And David and I are going to talk about the portrait works, which is what you're seeing here with the text installed as a line. as well as the Billboard Works, which are installed in multiple outdoor locations as public billboards. And we're going to finish today by talking about the Candy Works. Yeah.
So, thank you, Emilie.
Yeah.
And just to pick up, do you want to, maybe we'll go back to an image of the stacks and talk about that for a little bit more to like dig in. I like that. Maybe the kids.
You want to stay with the kids?
Yeah,
Okay.
stay with the children. I have one of my favorite pieces of printed matter when it comes to sort of avant-garde art practices and distribution and interventions with an audience that isn't in a formal gallery space is an anecdote about the Surrealist Circle in Paris. They made these little cards that they called papillons, like butterflies, and they had different Surrealist sayings on them that they would distribute outside of the office of Surrealism in Paris in the 20s and 30s. And the idea of the papillons is that they would flutter around the city, containing the Surrealist messages, infiltrating urban spaces in ways that paintings on walls could not, or a sculpture was fixed in place. So that there was an inherent sense of movement with the work, and a movement specifically across urban space in ways that relied on chance encounters, affirming chance encounters, and affirming the movement that wasn't under their control. And when we think about, and this is maybe sort of providing a preface to Felix Gonzalez Torres, and then moving into the 1960s and 70s with contemporary art, you have an idea of conceptual artworks that were challenging and reacting against sort of the orthogonal space of a gallery or a museum. The white cube was something that artists were sort of problematizing, criticizing, or trying to escape, and drawing lines of flight outside of that space. So the history of conceptual art, like these children holding the posters, was about escaping the white cube in some way, and how works could be ephemeral, could move over space, and could take place across, we'll see later with Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt, in unexpected areas, engaging with the environment, or within urban spaces that were chance encounters. Robert Morris, an artist that just died this year, had a really interesting project at the Leo Castelli Gallery in 1968 that was called Continuous Project Altered Daily. So the remnants of that show, which changed, it was a work of sculpture that changed over the course of the month. The real remnant of that work was a map poster that he created showing the coordinates of the work changing in a grid over time. So there was a sense that what you had as the remainder was part of the work, this map that was created by showing flux, or how flux could be charted in the space of a gallery. With Torres, my first encounter with his work was at the Hirshhorn Gallery in 1994, where I encountered one of the pieces, the stacks pieces, which had one pile that said, "Somewhere better than this place," and the next pile is "Nowhere better than this place." And I took both, and I hung them in my college dorm room. Both. It probably got at sort of some angstiness of college. And
the very first slide that I started on had that work in the beginning.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pull that up. Sorry for all the slide activity. So that's the work right here. The "Somewhere better than this place, nowhere better than this place."
Yeah, and the poetry embedded in the piece needed me. And with the kids that were holding the posters, they were part of the work. The work happens here. the work happens in museum collections and is advised by the foundation, but the work needs us for it to happen, the same way that these papillons in Paris needed to be dispersed by the people that were given them in the streets. There was a carrier that took these away, and it gets at some elements of what Felix Gonzalez Torres thought about art as a kind of virus. He wants his art to be sort of a virus within a museum, within an institution that sort of creates problems, but also creates paths out in terms of its dispersion, and the audience not passively participating in the work, but actually activating it and moving it across space outside of the coordinates of the gallery, I think is the element that is not animated in the still images, but by the kids holding the posters. So you have that as the primary site, as a non-site, as a site that is speculative and almost utopian. And I think the foundation is part of the job becomes sort of facilitating that encounter, and in terms of the setting it up here and in other places, that becomes part of the negotiation, right, that you described.
Yeah.
Sort of setting the terms to allow for that original intention of the encounter.
No, that's a
Yeah.
big part of what we do is how do you provide an exhibitor with directions that are open-ended, directions that are not directions, a map that's a non-map, so that they have the opportunity to negotiate this and navigate this on their own terms. And that very closely mimics then what a viewer comes and navigates the work on their own terms as well and is making their own meaning. Because that is, it's a quote that's very often repeated by Felix Gonzalez Torres. I need the public to complete the work itself, they're necessary. So you have kind of on either end of this physical form that's existing in an exhibition, quite a bit of negotiation and subjective decision making on behalf of the exhibitor and then the viewer that takes it. And we end up, I don't know, kind of existing as a hand-holding entity to say, and many times that ends up being, people will come to us and ask, what is the exact paper size I should use? Is this appropriate? To which it's kind of a bit of a dance and saying, it's really not our place to say. It's your decision to make on your own. If you really need us to opine, if you're stuck, let us know, but it's your decision. So there's some push with that, for sure.
Yeah. And when you're looking at these stacks, it doesn't scream out that these are public sculptures, but that was the intention. Where Felix Gonzalez Torres was invited to do things. His career was engaging with galleries and that kind of thing in the 80s and into the 90s, and he was interested in making public sculptures, and this is the result in some way, as his first attempt as a kind of public sculpture. And would you agree with that?
There's another quote that I can call on is at the time there was quite a bit of buzz around public sculptures and art that was being exhibited in the public realm that had a very specific and overt political message or just message in general. It didn't even necessarily have to be political. To which Gonzalez Torres said something to the effect of public art isn't always going to be made of some all-weather durable material that you can put together in really big assemblages. Sometimes it's going to be something that the public can actually take home with them. So no, absolutely. I think it was a part of the ethos of making at the time, and it's a huge part of the paper stacks in general. And that first paper stack work that I showed you, Untitled 1988, speaks to that as well, where we are looking more in detail on that, and that it is this incredibly democratic size. Anyone would take a letter-sized sheet of paper. It had information on it that you would be used to taking in a gallery setting, akin to a press release or an invitation or a postcard. So it was made even more public in that way, in its scale and accessibility as well.
Yeah, and it falls into a tradition that was happening sort of in the contemporary art world at the time of thinking of publishing artist books, posters, flyers as a sort of cheap democratic multiple. If everyone could own it, no one could own it kind of scenario that that was part of a continuum of the same idea of problematizing or criticizing or disrupting the normal way that art was received or distributed in a commercial setting, in the marketplace, and trying to sort of present complications to that normal transactional process of art and galleries and that kind of thing.
No, I'm happy that you brought that up as well, because that's really something that's quite core to these works, is that it really challenges the threshold of what is ownable. With a paper stock work like this, you're getting a certificate of authenticity that describes a letter-sized sheet that has the text that runs along, the bottom of the sheet, and nothing else. And then you're tasked with the responsibility to make it physically manifest. So you're there, so it may be something that at this point in art making and in history is something that owners are more, readily willing to accept and to kind of embark on as a part of their collection. But at the time, there was a lot of kind of push and pull of what should then be included in even the invoices, so that owners felt comfortable knowing that they were owning something by acquiring this work. So no, it was very much a part of that questioning of ownership and decentralizing the role of the collector in the art world ecology in general.
Yeah, and it's part of Gonzalez Torres' biography. He was part of a collective called Group Material in New York that was a heady group of thinkers, artists that were living in downtown New York and setting up alternative spaces for art and engagement with non-traditional audiences, engaging communities, thinking of new ways that art could be made and distributed. And coming out of that background, he had to face questions about how to be a gallery artist or how to sell work, and keeping with general principles that were part of his background. And I think with this work, and we'll get into the next body of work maybe, is this push and pull between what is public and what is private, and sort of the ambiguity there of the work being intimate and accessible, but also not your image, but an image that you can relate to as intimate, and chance encounters that happen in urban spaces with the images that he was creating that provided senses of intimacy, but also and relational aspects of a very personal narrative of his, but also a distance as well to that intimacy. So I think you'll see more clearly when we get to maybe some of the Billboard works what that refers to.
And one of the beauties of Felix's work, as I was going to say, actually it's a perfect segue into the portrait works.
Yeah.
And which we saw here on this Instagram post. So let me catch you up. Sorry for shuffling through the slides again. This is Untitled 1989, one of the artist's portrait works. The portrait works consist of a line or line of text installed just below the point where the wall meets the ceiling. And the content of the portraits is a series of events and dates that can change each and every time that the work is exhibited. So the exhibitor can actually choose to add, can subtract, reshuffle the content itself. And I'm going to present a case study today on a portrait that the artist did of another individual. But to give you an idea of kind of the texture of that change, here is the portrait that we were just looking at, each of the text iterations that the artist installed during his lifetime. So you see that it contracts and expands and shifts quite drastically. The portrait work that we're going to look at today more closely is Untitled Portrait of Andrea Rosen. this is the work as it was installed in her gallery on Prince Street in Soho. And as you see the text wrapping around, if you see a silver 1982 as one item, this is a nice example of the types of change that can happen. But here's the work installed again in her gallery in Chelsea about 15 years later. She's decided to change the date on silver. Do we know why? No. It's not really necessary to have some sort of like didactic and specific record on why that change was made. But just as David was talking about, Felix was very interested in disrupting these binaries, both of what is ownable, what is not, especially what is public and private, and the fact that identity is made up of public and private events. And the way that he can, the content of the text for the portraits was kind of initially brought together or drafted, is that he would ask the sitter, Andrea Rosen in this case, to supply a list of events and dates that they felt were especially formative in their identity. He would receive that list, interject information that he thought was just as important, that was maybe more significant to a historical or public record, and then determine the ordering of the text. And it's not as if when the artist passed away, so too did the opportunity for this continue to change. Anytime the work is exhibited, the owner has the opportunity to reconsider that. So we're going to look today at the work installed in 2016 in Shanghai. This is again Untitled Portrait of Andrea Rosen. And in this situation, Andrea Rosen still owns the work, and she decided to lend to the curators the right to choose the content of the text. And so what you see here is an installation view, and with each installation of a portrait, what the foundation does to record this is we ask for a full documentation of everything they recorded, and that in some way points to the way in which the work kind of occupied the architecture of the space. So this is the map that they provided. So if you look at the top right corner, that corresponds with the slide we were just looking at. I'm not sure if you can see that from the back, but I promise it does. And what was especially interesting about this case is that they made so many changes to this text. So here's the version of the text that Andrea Rosen provided to the curators. And here's the version of the text that was actually installed. I've highlighted in red all the items that the curators chose to omit from what she provided, and highlighted below in green everything that they decided to add. So there's a real opportunity to shift things along the way. And even more so, which is an interesting nod to place, is that this also marks the first installation of a portrait work in Mandarin. So the work was installed on the outside of the atrium. This is the inside, and you have the Mandarin text kind of corresponding on the inside. And this is another way of making a work publicly accessible to an audience in Shanghai. It hadn't been translated into other languages before, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't be. And there wasn't anything that said that it that it couldn't be, and so it was. And so we also have the corresponding maps in Mandarin. But yeah, the portraits are a really a great body of work in that way, and looking at the binary or lack thereof. As Emilie says, she doesn't believe in binaries because they don't exist. That you can find in these works and in the portraits in general, and you can really trace to the artist's entire practice.
Yeah, it's interesting to see them laid out as text accumulated in one place as sort of sets of data.
Yeah.
That sort of wouldn't have been clear to me without seeing it laid out like that, in terms of coordinates that would map to a biography.
Right.
And it was 2 points, a date and a place, or that kind of thing that allow for this silhouette of a set of personalities or possible personalities. You try to figure out, oh, you see Trudeau in there, maybe they're Canadian, that kind of mapping.
And
that
one of the switches that they made is, I think Andrea included Trudeau 1967, and they switched it to Trudeau 2015.
That's funny.
But yeah, there is something to be gleaned from really looking at the coordinates of these pieces and the mapping I think someone was talking about this earlier, mapping is really just a record of choices, which is truly what Gonzalez Torres' work is. And when you have the chance to spend time with the archives that we keep, what you end up looking at. But we're running out of time, and I definitely want to talk about the Billboard Works, because when David and I met last weekend, we're talking about works that were especially meaningful to him. He brought up this installation printout that MoMA put on in 2012. Because it was actually right around the corner or very close to his offices. Is that right?
Yeah.
And this is that Van Damme location. So this should have been your exact billboard.
Yeah, totally. In New York City, in Long Island City, there's a secondary location for MoMA where a lot of the archive and library was kept, as well as art storage. So this was sort of a block down from where I worked part of the time. And this is one of the billboard pieces that were installed as part of an exhibition at MoMA in 2011?
2012.
2012, yeah.
And the Billboard Works, I should walk you through just a few of the parameters of those works. The Billboard Works are made manifest by taking either text or specific imagery, installing it on public billboard advertising spaces in multiple outdoor locations. So to quickly walk you through the beautiful images that MoMA took of this project, here they are in the 6 locations as they were installed in 2012. With the Billboard Works, it's a parameter of the work that the image has to be full bleed, that there can't be any text overlying the image, there can't be any descriptive didactics that even situate this as an artwork kind of in the fabric of the urban environment. So that you are, again, interacting with the work completely on your own terms, even if that's not your choosing. And another aspect of these works is that once that requirement has been met of installing the work in 6 outdoor locations at a minimum, there's the opportunity to also install it indoors in one space using the same materials and methodologies that you would use at billboard scale. But there's actually an intention of these works, which we thought could be interesting today. It's a part of the work itself that photo documentation is kept of every single billboard location, and that some sort of mapping takes place so that there is a record of the way that the work has existed in the world. And what was interesting with MoMA is the way that they chose to record that. It's very Manhattan. It's by giving you cross streets. So again, this is the location that was close to David's office, but these are the 6 outdoor locations. And another thing we wanted to share with you all is that it's not as if the foundation kind of dictates the level of detail or exactly what information should be included on a map of billboards, but it ends up being interestingly representative of the sense of place in that location. So here we have the same billboard work installed the following year in New Jersey. And it's funny to think about New Jersey in the context of the discussion earlier, because they situated the works in the context of their proximity to highways and freeways and ways in and out of Jersey. And then you have, I wanted to just pull up 2 other maps. Here's a billboard work that was shown in Hong Kong in 2015 at tramway stations. So they just relied on a pre-existing map and called out where it could be located. And then this same work was shown just last year in Mexico City, where they based the map on the 16 municipalities of Mexico City. So you have this interesting record of place that responds to it, but also is clearly informing the way that the billboard is, kind of distributed through any particular location.
Yeah, I remember in that context of decisions at MoMA and in these other cases, you have decisions that are based on transit flow, and like the one in Long Island City was related to the elevated subway, the exit ramp to the Queensboro Bridge, this pedestrian passage. So there was a a calculus that happened in regards to the movement of bodies in the city space and where people would arrive at the billboard. And you see with New Jersey, the planning was more related to road traffic and car traffic. So you have sort of an analysis of movement in urban and suburban or exurban spaces, and decisions that happen about the placement.
Yeah. And then I think we're almost out of time. You are. I am? Darn. Well, I should share this because this is the candy spill work, Untitled Revenge. It is similar to the paper stack works that have an ideal height. Candy spill works have an ideal weight, which again is negotiated at the point of each exhibition. The change around the candy works become especially apparent when you see them in ongoing exhibitions. This is the same work installed by the artist 3 years later in 1994 at the Renaissance Society. Obviously very different, and I will rush through these, I promise. And then here is this same work installed at the Renaissance Society. I don't want to skip over it. About 20 years later, sorry. I didn't wait. You were right. Which was a project that Jordan Stein curated. And this is another really radical installation. So you have a situation where he chose to incorporate the work into these marginal administrative spaces outside of the exhibition space for whatever the circumstances of the exhibition were. And this is all the same exhibition, and actually there's another location as well that isn't pictured here, but he was installing the work in multiple locations in one exhibition. So that's possible as well. And this is a hugely rich part of our archive, but there's also always the opportunity to revert back to decisions that have been made previously. And it's a nice way to end things because it made me think of the Fremont Map when we were talking about that earlier. As you know, here are these particular ways of doing things that we have recorded. There's quite a bit of space that has not yet been charted. But you can always use the map too. There's a way of using it as a means of wayfinding. So we can end it there. I'm sorry.
Hi. Do you ever say no to requests?
Excellent repetition. Do we ever say no to requests? It's funny because we very often get that question. It's not that
you ever say no to that question?
No, I do not. I can confidently say no to that. No, but there are definitely times where there is almost like a fetishizing of original choices that were made by the artist, and that we do try to discourage because that runs up against the work in a way that the artist didn't intend. It's not about trying to go back and find the exact paper brand weight and size that happened to be exhibited in Europe when you're showing the work in Kansas. That would make those measurements so precious and so divorced from the exhibition context that it would start to become more an artwork of the curator or the exhibitor rather than an artwork by Gonzalez Torres. So no no's, but coaxing for sure.
I didn't read all of the descriptions of different works roughly, but all the ones I looked at, they all had a description of endless supply or something.
Yeah.
Similar, a lot of them do. Were any of the pieces, did they have sort of a finite amount fixed so that you have a degradation of the pieces that necessarily weren't?
No, and it's
The question was.
Oh, right, sorry.
A lot of the descriptions of the edition were endless, but within specific works, were there any limits placed on the edition?
There's also an entire part of the artist practice that consists of what we call static works. So there are, physical works that don't shift over time, framed photographs, etc. But with the manifestable works, what you get is that certificate where you have a description of the original, but there's always a caveat that's baked in, not only in the caption itself, but in the description of the artwork. It invariably ends with, if this candy is not available, a similar candy may be used. If this paper is not available, a similar paper may be used. And it gets pretty granular, those descriptions. Some of them, especially with the billboards, I think there was some struggle to really describe just how commonplace these materials were, where some of those original certificates were even describing who you should call at Triumph billboards for help in installing them, so that it really maintained its the material nature of a billboard itself. But yeah, there is always that little twist on the end. Something similar may be used.
Yes.
I could ask about 200 questions on intellectual property issues.
Totally. Let's dance.
Talk your way through what constitutes infringement, what constitutes,
Okay.
What constitutes infringement and what constitutes?
well, Creative Commons and how do you approach the
Yeah.
intellectual property?
Yeah. Okay, so basically, especially with let's use the Billboard Works as a good example of that, because what an owner is getting is more or less an exclusive, limited copyright to reproduce an image by the artist in a very specific form, following specific parameters. They're open-ended, you can interpret them, but there's still something that you're holding on to there. If David was to make a T-shirt with that, or anything that fell outside of the parameters of that artwork and attribute it to Gonzalez Torres, that's infringement. That's infringement on the copyright per se. What's an interesting area that we're finding ourselves in that you might like to know about as well is that current copyright law, as it is written, doesn't necessarily protect the images of any of these artworks because they're not fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So that ends up being interesting conversations. Those are some no's that we say as far as what is and what isn't an image of the artwork itself. But I think that's more of an issue of the law needing to catch up a bit. But what else could we talk about with intellectual property?
Would you say, like, in terms of Andrea Rosen was the gallerist that worked closely with Felix Gonzalez Torres and worked towards making the certificate actually kind of part of the work, would you say?
For sure.
And so you enter into this interesting zone where it becomes functional in transactions and stuff like that, but it actually can be considered part of the work. The language, the choices, the kinds of things that are limited or not limited is sort of within the parameters of what I would consider the work.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting in terms of that history that maybe starts in a post-60s period of artists engaging with ownership or making ambiguous what the work is. These questions of contracts come up and is something that gets played around with.
And the certificates themselves are really closer to contracts in that, especially the certificates that the artist was issuing, towards the end of his life, in that he was signing them alongside the owner. They were both agreeing to what would be done in order, or what could be carried out and then attributed to the artist. And there's also this kind of interesting, and what sometimes for exhibitors is quite frustrating, aspect of the certificates themselves is that they were actually intended to be quite private documents. That this document as a suite of information was only ever intended to be considered by the owner. And you can see some history around that in that, if a work was loaned, it wasn't simply a matter of photocopying the certificate and faxing it to an exhibitor. Instead, it takes a lot more work. You're having to include full information, some of it gleaned from the certificate, some of it gleaned from past exhibitions, et cetera, et cetera. But there is, I bring that up just because the private ownership of that kind of core information of the work was always there, even though and that was, I think, part of toying with what is ownership. So you were the gatekeeper or safeguarding that information.
Yeah, I have a question about, it seems to me that the role of the archivist and librarian is getting enormous now with contemporary work. So this is a question for you, David, and also for you, Emilie. Is the role of the librarian and archivist getting, in fact, more critical in keeping the art actually alive as opposed to art, say, 200 years ago?
Yes, it's incredibly important and critical and should be much better paid.
It's essential.
I'm just kidding. There should be cars. No, it's really interesting, and you get at works that in the past, I was part of accessions of large collections of conceptual work, other things that entered MoMA, and we had meetings about whether the work should exist in the library, the archive, or the collection, like a Fluxus score, where it was an instruction of how to destroy a piano. Where does that go? Or like a dance, a score for a dance. Is that an archival document? Is that the work? And where should that go? And when you get into artists' archives, increasingly you have bits of documentation that are works and bits that are traditional archival material, letters, correspondence, and that kind of thing. But especially if you're talking about this like post-1960s period of art making and ephemeral art gestures that took place in a specific time-based way, there's a lot of questions that are asked of what is the work, how to document the work, where does the documentation go, that bounces between a museum collection and an archive or a library. That's all outside of all of the works that I would say are all of the works that artists were involved with in terms of artists' books and publishing. Like that's a whole other area that I'm engaged with pretty closely, a history of artists making books and magazines and serial publications. So.
It is something that we're very aware of in the foundation, and something that we hope that we properly bake into all of the language that we distribute, is that the information in our archives is totally secondary to the work. The work doesn't rely on it. You don't need to see any of these images. You can always go back to those original parameters. You can engage with that language, and the work will exist long after the foundation does. So it's something that we're anticipating in the language that we use, in the way that it's framed, in the way that decisions are presented to exhibitors. And again, in the very process of that, the reason why we're not making those decisions is because the foundation will not always exist, and the work will hopefully continue to exist after that. So we're constantly pushing them back on exhibitors, because that will be the long-term life of the work. David Rumsey?
Well, in that regard, could you say a little bit about how the foundation came into being and how long you expect to be doing this work?
When did the Felix Gonzalez Torres Foundation get founded? And how?
The foundation was founded in 2002. Andrea Rosen was Gonzalez Torres' gallerist in his lifetime, and they had a very close relationship. And the artist passed away in 1996. He died of AIDS-related complications and knew that he was dying, and in many ways deputized Andrea to kind of take over or continue the work or do what was necessary so that the work could continue itself, is probably the best way to describe it. And Andrea is the president of the foundation. She set this up so that there could be an entity outside of a commercial gallery that was collecting that information, making it available, et cetera, so that it was more democratic, I guess, as an access point.
And why would you not exist in the future?
Why would you not exist in the
said you
future?
you implied that at some point your work may be finished.
Single artist foundations are a relatively new phenomenon. When did they start? In the 60s in the US? specifically around conceptual art, because you had a situation where with a lot of artists' work, let's use Donald Judd as an example, if you're not interpreting that work to the T, if you're not exactly following those instructions, it is not the work. And that is something that Felix referenced. He's like, it's okay if you're 2 inches off, you still got it. So you have this history of bodies being in place so that the work could continue to exist after the artist is alive. I don't know how long any of these will be, but since it's relatively recent, we can say it's probably not, nothing's permanent. Or another Felix quote, which is back actually from Heraclitus: the only thing that is permanent is change. So we're certain that that there's got to be a time when the foundation doesn't exist. Who knows when that is? But we also think that the work is, resilient enough that it actually might keep going.
It's a good place to end, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. So we're going to take a 10-minute stretch break. We will return at 2:45 to hear Stanford's own David Medeiros, mapmaker, to be interviewed by Stanford's own art historian, Emanuela Lully. So please join us back in 10 minutes. Thank you.